Hello everyone, today I'm sharing something special for Iran. Let's subscribe and sati with me for my analysis. Iran believed missiles and drones will be enough to secure its position against the United States. But the Tehran regime is already signaling retreat on a front where it couldn't even deploy its forces, the energy table. The naval pressure the United States has applied around the Strait of Hormuz is cutting through every artery of Iran's economy, one by one. Donald Trump dismissed Tehran's compromise proposal, reopened Hormuz and set the nuclear issue aside for later without even pausing to consider it. And then a development that caught Iran completely off guard sent shockwaves to the global arena. The United Arab Emirates made a striking decision regarding OPEC, unveiling a surprising route capable of bypassing Iran's biggest leverage card, Hormuz. These moves are turning Tehran's energy market into a scene of collapse within a matter of days. The country's oil economy is quite literally gasping for breath right now. The countdown has effectively begun for the Tehran regime. Iran has only 12 to 22 days of unused storage capacity remaining. The moment the window closes, Tehran will be forced to cut another 1.5 million barrels from its daily oil production. At Chabahar, the only serious export terminal outside Hormuz, where on a normal day only 5 ships would be moored, today more than 20 tankers and cargo vessels sit jammed and waiting. The naval pressure has slashed Iran's energy exports by 70%. Tehran is losing $13 billion every single month. Astonishing, but true. Every month, a staggering sum is evaporating from the country's financial ledger. The situation has grown so dire that as a last resort, the Iranian regime has begun using scrapped, deteriorating ships as floating storage. But behind the curtain, there is a far bigger and far more dangerous picture for Iran. The storm brewing within the regime itself is even heavier than the crisis visible from the outside. Iran's Supreme National Security Council has issued highly critical signals that with a deteriorating economy, anti-regime protests could erupt once again. What's more, the council cited a surprising figure for how long Iran can withstand this pressure. Tehran may have very little time left, but that is not the only source of concern. The country's labor force is also caught in a massive crisis. By the end of spring, millions of people in Iran's private sector could lose their jobs. In other words, a second crisis is at the door for the IRGC and the regime both, as they intend to continue their standoff with the United States. Iran is being dragged toward a position of leaving every energy card it holds on the table and quietly accepting defeat. Tehran's last energy weapon no longer works. So how did all of this stack up on top of each other? The origins, effects, and consequences of this striking collapse will genuinely surprise you. Because the very first mistake that drove the regime into this dead end was choosing to threaten the Gulf states and spread the fear of prolonged confrontation throughout the region instead of thinking about its energy revenues. Yes, you read that correctly. The regime effectively created its own trap. This flawed decision pushed Iran into perhaps its most critical turning point. The roots of the country's energy and storage crisis took shape precisely at this point. The reality behind this crisis emerges clearly in the report by maritime intelligence firm Kepler. In March 2026, Iran's daily oil export stood at 1.85 million barrels. 2 weeks after the pressure began, that number crashed to 567,000 barrels. If the current pace continues, Iran's storage facilities will be packed full in short order, and the moment they fill up, production has to stop. But the real danger is not the short-term loss. It is permanent industrial collapse, because a significant portion of the wells that get shut down can never return to their former capacity. In petroleum engineering literature, this is called irreversible production loss. Analysts estimate the permanent loss at between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day. Even if the pressure is lifted, Iran's oil industry may never return to its former state. Tehran is suffering not merely a temporary shock, but a permanent loss of industrial capacity. This means that a single standoff is wiping out the country's entire vision for the future of its energy sector. The regime is leaving behind not just today's revenue, but tomorrow's capacity as well. With the closure of export routes at the port of Chabahar as well, the losses will likely be impossible to recover. This port had for years been Tehran's strategic trump card, the plan B it pointed to in case Hormuz were ever disrupted. The port had been developed by India. It was also the exit gateway for the China and Russia-backed NSTC corridor Tehran viewed this port as one of the most strategic energy assets in its hands. Now, the wall of U.S. naval presence is rising in front of Tehran's Plan B as well. The tankers stranded at the port can no longer leave because vessels linked to Iran are also being halted in the Gulf of Oman. The Tehran regime is watching in real time as the alternative route it touted for years is reduced to a parking lot of stranded tankers, and Iran has nothing resembling a Plan C. What's even more striking is that India has shelved its Chabahar investment and signed a new contract with the UAE's Fujairah line. In other words, Iran's bridge to Asia is being abandoned even by its own partners. This represents an unprecedented erosion of Tehran's regional geopolitical standing. Even allies are pulling back, signaling that business with Iran carries too much risk. But only one of the Middle Eastern countries that recognize this risk is the UAE. Its decision to leave OPEC is the clearest evidence of this shift. But what truly shook Tehran was not the decision itself, it was a geopolitically significant location at the heart of its impact. We are talking about the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline controlled by the UAE. This 380-kilometer line carries oil directly to the Gulf of Oman without ever passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Since March 2026, exports to Fujairah have surged by 57%. The line is currently pumping nearly 1.9 million barrels of oil per day. By exiting OPEC, the UAE will be able to place an additional 1 million barrels per day onto the market, independent of any quotas. And Iran's entire Hormuz leverage strategy appears destined to collapse with a single move, because the UAE is now preparing to supply the oil the world wants from Fujairah. While Iran cannot find a single door beyond Hormuz, the UAE is opening a major artery that bypasses Hormuz entirely. The implications for Iran in the energy sphere are enormous. OPEC's share of global supply control has dropped from 30% to 26%. This figure is a disaster indicator for Iran because OPEC was keeping oil prices elevated through production quotas. High prices could have ensured that even Iranian oil sold through informal channels still generated meaningful revenue. The UAE's exit could trigger a wave of supply that drags prices down sharply. Iran, meanwhile, is losing both its export volume and its per barrel revenue at the same time. In other words, a two-front loss. In the wake of all this, it is only natural that the dark process triggered in Iran by the energy crisis and the decisions of regional actors is shaking the country to its core. And here what we encounter is the looming economic crisis the country is being pulled toward. Iran International's exclusive report dated April 27, 2026 spread through the world's press in a wave of shock. The Supreme National Security Council, chaired by Mohammed Bakr Zolgadar, had convened on an emergency basis, but this was no ordinary meeting. The assessment that leaked from the session read almost like a statement of concession. The council reached three core conclusions. First, protests could break out again within days. Economic pressure is already a primary trigger. Second, the regime can endure the current situation for at most 6 to 8 weeks. Third, by the end of spring, nearly 2 million jobs could be lost in the private sector. Security officials summarized their conclusion in a single sentence: unrest is inevitable, only its timing is uncertain. In other words, the regime's own security apparatus is already acknowledging on paper that the country could lose control of its streets within a few weeks. This is not a leaked fear. It resembles more than anything a quiet acceptance of reality. For years, the Iranian regime boasted with the rhetoric of a fortress economy, the resistance economy, the strategy that defies sanctions, the shielded system. All of those phrases are now meaningless. Now they are putting it in writing that the same fortress has only 6 to 8 weeks of life left in it. The social frustration that was suppressed after January could re-emerge under economic pressure. The council's warning makes that crystal clear. The question is no longer whether it will happen, but which day it will arrive. On another front, Tehran's acceptance of difficulty is not limited to this document alone. Even figures at the highest levels of the regime have come to grasp the full ramifications of the situation. One of them is Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. On April 25, 2026, he addressed the nation on state television. The speech was a sobering appeal. Pezeshkian openly told the people, reduce your electricity consumption. Then came the striking advice, instead of turning on 10 lamps in your home, turn on 2. What harm could there be? The president of Iran was asking his citizens to limit the number of lamps lit in their own homes. This may well be the last message the leader of a country that boasts of strategic strength should ever have to deliver. but Pezeshkian has no other card left to play. Government offices have begun operating on half-day schedules. Heating in the Tehran metro is reportedly being frequently cut. In major cities like Isfahan and Tabriz, streetlights have been reduced by half. The Iranian rial has plunged to 1.8 million against the dollar over the past 2 months. Annual inflation has surpassed 40%. Lines for bread, meat, and milk are growing longer. Imported medicine prices have risen by nearly 60%. Pezeshkian's appeal reflects a reality the regime, despite all its communication machinery, can no longer hide from its people. The social contract bought with subsidies is unraveling, and a president is asking his own people, please don't become a source of instability. So why is the regime allowing all this to unfold? In truth, Iran's economic crisis did not begin with today's events. A significant portion of oil revenues was flowing directly to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to Iraqi factions, to the so-called resistance network in Syria. Now that channel is blocked. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has reached the point of being unable to pay salaries. In Yemen, the Houthis are relying on their last remaining supplies. In Iraq, Shia factions are stepping back from the field because no funding has arrived. The Iranian regime is on the verge of losing within just a few weeks the proxy network it spent 40 years building. Every movement, every group, every operation requires funding, and funding is no longer flowing into Tehran's treasury. This silent financial collapse is also weakening Iran's regional influence piece by piece because the regime had earned its regional weight by investing in that network. Now the channel of investment is drying up, and regional standing is evaporating at a pace not seen in decades. The regime had chosen to prioritize the IRGC and its network over its own people. With today's emerging picture of economic crisis and the disruption of energy exports, Tehran is entering a process from which return is nearly impossible. Even U.S. officials are warning that if the Tehran regime continues with this approach, far more difficult days lie ahead. One of those voices is U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. On April 27, 2026, Bessent made a historic statement. Iran's oil pumping capacity will soon collapse. And his final observation found its echo almost immediately. A fuel shortage may genuinely be approaching in Iran in the very near future. A petroleum-producing country whose citizens may have to line up for gasoline is a paradox rarely seen in geopolitical history. But just days after Bessent's statement, satellite images released through official U.S. channels further deepened the picture. With its storage capacity exhausted, Iran is now using ships consigned to the scrapyard, decaying vessels incapable of putting to sea as floating oil storage units. Iran possesses one of the largest oil reserves in the world, but it cannot find a single free route through which to move that oil. Hormuz is under pressure, Chabahar is choked, Fujairah is in the UAE's hands. What remains for the Tehran regime is nothing but deteriorating vessels sitting around its ports, with crude oil being pumped into them as a desperate measure. The exits are closing one by one. One of the most striking aspects of all this is that with such heavy clouds gathering over the country, the IRGC still refuses to open its enriched uranium program to inspection. Perhaps the only path forward for Tehran is approving unlimited, immediate, and transparent access by the International Atomic Energy Agency to all sites in Iran. But under institutional pressure, Tehran's civilian government cannot even place this possibility on the table during negotiations. With any agreement with the United States gradually disappearing from view, we are approaching the end of the 47-year narrative of resistance. Since the 1979 revolution, the Iranian regime had mythologized its endurance against sanctions. Despite years of U.S. sanctions, European restrictions, and UN resolutions, Tehran had remained standing. "We have never collapsed" was the cornerstone of the regime's message to the world. But the 2026 situation is different. Because this is not merely a sanctions package, it is a physical maritime encirclement. Sanctions could be navigated through informal channels. Tankers would conduct ship-to-ship transfers, switch flags, turn off tracking systems. But a physical blockade stops ships at sea. A switched-off tracking signal is no obstacle when inspection teams can arrive by helicopter. A flag change provides no cover against satellite surveillance. The U.S. Navy now tracks every tanker individually, identifies it, and boards it if necessary. The tanker Tiffany was logged and stopped. The vessel Majestic X was also seized. And most recently, on April 28, 2026, the Comoros-flagged MV Blue Star 3 was halted in the Gulf of Oman. Inspection teams boarded the ship and conducted a thorough search. When no evidence was found in the vessel's voyage plan indicating a stop at an Iranian port, the ship was released. But the message was unmistakable. Around Hormuz and its surroundings, no ship can approach Iran without authorization. These operations prove that the encirclement is not merely a maritime maneuver, it is a tight legal and logistical net. Insurance companies have canceled all transport policies along the Hormuz line. Tanker owners have removed Iran routes from their operational lists. Even Asian buyers have stepped back from Iranian oil supply because the inspection of a tanker is no longer a hypothetical. It has become an almost routine occurrence. Iran's strategy of selling oil through informal channels is being tracked around the clock by surveillance aircraft and Sentinel-2 satellites. Every official announcement marks another step in Iran's withdrawal from the global oil market. What no sanctions package could ever achieve, the blockade is achieving in just a few weeks. The Council's assessment of we can hold out for 6 to 8 weeks is born precisely from this new reality. Resistance was once possible. Not anymore. The world has not witnessed a physical maritime encirclement of this scale in the last 50 years. The standoff during the Cuban Missile Crisis was short-lived. The Yugoslavia restrictions were partly symbolic. The maritime pressures on North Korea were limited. But this 2026 Iran situation is an entirely different category. So what awaits Iran in the days ahead? There are likely 3 possible scenarios for the regime. In the first scenario, the regime steps back and brings its nuclear program to the table. In that case, an agreement is signed in exchange for lifting the encirclement. But this scenario would represent an enormous shift in Tehran's domestic politics. The Revolutionary Guards could interpret this retreat as a betrayal of principles. In the second scenario, the regime resists and the pressure continues. In this possibility, the protests the Council warned of could emerge. Internal unrest could merge with economic collapse, and the regime could be forced into a difficult confrontation with its own citizens. We have already witnessed similar dynamics during the protest waves of January. In the third scenario, a broader strategic decision could be made at the international level. Iran's nuclear infrastructure and key installations could become targets. If this scenario unfolds, Tehran would likely face consequences far more severe than any it has encountered so far. So what do you think about all of this? We look forward to your thoughts and comments below. And to make those long drives more enjoyable, we also invite you to join us on Spotify, where we share our full audio content. Thank you for choosing us